Welcome to part 3 of our HTTP module in make.com tutorial series. In this video, we're going to look at API. So we already looked at what a webhook is and what JSON is and how JSON works and how we can create a JSON string and how we can structure it. So definitely make sure that you understand that before you move on with this video. So the first thing that we want to do is we're going to look at what is an API before we're going to use it inside of Make, because the HTTP module is allowing us to use APIs and to call APIs and use their information. So let's look at what this means. So an API stands for Application Programming Interface. And what it allows us is to communicate between different software or between different servers. So you have one software or server or website, and you want to get the data from there to use it on another server. And in order to achieve that, you need to use this thing called an API. So let's look at this little example here. So we have the user, for example, in a restaurant, and he makes a request via the API. So the server, in this case, not the computer server, but the person working as a server in the service industry, he is going to the user and taking the request to then send it over to the kitchen. And the kitchen then prepares everything. So the API is sending that request to the kitchen saying, hey, user wanted wine and spaghetti or whatever. And then once the kitchen is ready, it's sending over the response to the API, which can be the pizza, which can be the pasta, then wine, and so forth. And the API or the server is then sending that response over to the user, giving the user all of the relevant things, such as wine, pasta, pizza, and so forth. So what are key components of an API or of APIs? Well, there are the endpoints, and the endpoints is the URLs for specific data or actions. So an endpoint is just the link that you enter into your URL tab, for example, right? So let me show you. This here has the endpoint edit, okay? Or this entire URL with the endpoint edit. And this is the action where it says, well, I can edit this presentation, for example. Then there are the different request types. So you can either get information, you can post information, meaning you can send new information to a server that would probably then store the information in a database. And with get, you would get the information from the database. Then you can also put information in the database. This is the keyword that will update an entry in a database. And finally, you can delete items from a database. So from a server that has a database. And then there are these things called headers, and there you can send metadata, like for example, authentication tokens. So a database usually is secured, so you cannot just access it without being authenticated, so allowed to access the data. For example, if you log in to your social media accounts, you don't want anyone else to have access to your social media account, so you need to log in, and then you are authenticated. And once you are authenticated once, you don't need to authenticate again, because usually you get something called a token, and this token then is stored on your device, for example. And then when you open up the server again and you request data from the server or the application again, such as, let's say, Facebook or Instagram or whatever, it just knows, oh, you are that user and you are signed in or authenticated. If you go to a separate device and start the application again, you are not going to be authenticated. You would need to authenticate with that phone again in order to then get access to your account, okay? And the responses that you get from an API, they are often in JSON format. It says often, it's not always. There are different types of formats available as well, but JSON is just the format that is agreed upon that most servers are using or most APIs are using, because it's very efficient, it's easy to read, and it's also easy to read for computers, not just for humans. So if we look at that, we have the client, for example, our computer or our phone. It sends an HTTP request, which is either get, post, delete, or put with a URL. So here, for example, whatever the URL of the API is, that goes then to the server. The server then understands what needs to be done. For example, get some information about, let's say, Dennis. So get the information, name, age, skills, address, get all of this information from the server. The server then responds with a JSON file that has all of this information and sends it over to the client. So the client then can read this information and visually prepare it so that it looks a little nicer. So coming back to the example with, let's say, your Instagram account, there you log in and you want to have details about your feed. So it sends a request to the server, give me feed. So then the server responds with the feed. So all of the URLs that are relevant for your feed, all the videos, all the images, how many likes are on the video, how many comments are on the video, and so forth. All this information is sent over to your phone, and your phone then also requests the data. Very often the data, like the video itself and so forth, is stored on a separate server, and then it downloads the image or the video and displays it on your phone. Okay, and does it in a nice manner. So not just in an ugly JSON file. So now let's go ahead and actually use an API here. So I'm going to unlink this webhook. I'm going to connect that webhook to this tutorial API. And the one that I'm using here is spoonacular.com. Okay, so you can go over to this website. It's called spoonacular.com/food-api/docs #authentication. So this is where you can read about authentication. But then let's say you want to search recipes and you would use the GET request like we saw earlier. Okay, so this is where you get the GET request. If you want to, let's say, get a random recipe, so this would be that. You would use this endpoint, so this URL with the GET request as well. And the response headers are going to be, well, you're going to get data in JSON. So that's what kind of information you're going to get. And you're going to get a few parameters. So how about we just try that? So we use this URL, we copy it, and then we go over to our own automation here. So that was the one that we used for JSON. So I'm going to delete all the modules that we had here. And I'm just going to use an HTTP module, make a request. Here I'm going to add the URL. Okay, so this is this URL that I got from here. And I'm going to say the method is get. I get that from here. So it says get. Then I need to pass headers. So I need to pass a header. Therefore, you need to be signed in. So once you are signed in, you get access to something called an API key. An API key is unique to your account, and so that they know that you are the one who is requesting this information. And this also authenticates you, so to speak, right? So once you are signed in, you will find that you get an API key. Okay, so coming back to our HTTP module, you need to add headers here, and you need to give it the name as well as here the API key that you got from your own account. So in order to get that key, once you are logged in, you go to your profile and API key, and then you click on show hide API key, and then you can copy that key. Or you can click on generate new API key in case you want to use a separate or a new API key for your new solution. Okay, so then you can paste that value in here. Now important is going to be what you enter as the name for the header. Okay, so let me go back to the docs, and we need to go to authentication here. Therefore, we can search for authentication, and you have the authentication guide where it says you need to send the API key with your API key. So you can access this with this URL. So let me just show you what I mean by this. Okay, so we saw earlier, if you want to get a random recipe, what we can do is we can copy this thing here, and then going back to the authentication here, we needed to add this to our URL. So I'm just going to add this to the URL equals, and then the API key that I have. All right, so I'm going to use that API key in here after the equal sign, press enter. And this is the output that I'm getting. So you see, I get the output and in JSON format. It's pretty overwhelming, but if you click on this pretty print, you see it looks a lot more enticing or readable. Okay, so it generated this a lot more readable JSON document or JSON text that I can now read. So it created a recipe, or it created recipes. You see here, squared brackets. What does it mean? It's an array. We know that, right? We saw how arrays work. So whenever we have a squared bracket, that's an array inside of JSON. So one of the items that we get is this one here. So it creates this recipe, and there are a lot of details about this recipe. For example, that it is a vegetarian recipe. It's not vegan, so vegan is set to false. It's gluten-free, it's not dairy-free, it's not very healthy, it's not very cheap, it's not very popular, and so forth, right? And then you get some details about the ingredients that are in there, then, well, all of the ingredients, and so forth, okay? So this is the response that you get. Now you could go ahead and use this response in order to build this out in a beautiful interface and make it look nice and create a very beautiful recipe user interface. I even created a course on that particular example for my Android masterclass, where we teach that in depth. But this is not about coding. This is about how you can use it in here. So how can we now make sure that this header has the right information? Well, therefore, we can go back to our authentication here. And you can see here where it says, alternatively, you can put the API key in the request header as X API key or X minus API minus key. So let's do that. Let's add that to our headers. You can see that headers word again with the name X API key and the value, which is the API key that we have gotten from our own console here under profile API key. Okay. So the body type there, we can say it's raw. And then we can say it's JSON application JSON, because the response that we're getting is of that particular type. So it is a JSON response. This here is a JSON response that we get. So you select the content type JSON, the body type raw, and then you can click on OK. At this point, we can run our automation. Now you wouldn't even need the webhook here. Actually, we can even say that we deactivate this unlink and we drag this in here. So if we do that, then this automation will be triggered immediately as data arrives, for example. Well, that wouldn't work. Now that let me delete this module. We could say every 15 minutes, for example, or every 1 minute or whatever. So, however, I'm going to do it with my webhook. I'm going to use one of my webhooks from earlier, the webhook tutorial one. I'm going to copy this address and I'm going to connect it to here, and this will send back the trigger to the webhook. So now I'm going to run this once, and I'm going to use the webhook that I just got from here, the URL, okay? So you use the URL from your webhook, you go over here, you enter your URL. This time you don't need to add any information. I just use the webhook to trigger the automation, okay? I don't pass any information from this webhook. And once I did that, my automation is being run, and my API call is happening. So we did make our first HTTP request, and we used an API for that. And now this was our input. You see a lot of data that we never even touched, but it automatically happens through the HTTP make request. And the URL, that's what we have as the interesting part. We use this random recipes URL, and then as the output, we get this bundle 1 with a status code of 200. We're going to go deeper into status codes in video 6 of this series, and 200 just means success. You got the data. Then we see the headers. Well, I'm not going to go into those. I'm interested in the data. And the data is the actual output. So this is the output that we got. Now we can copy all of that. And we go back to our friend here from JSON formatter, and we just paste all of that in here and we process it. And then we're going to get this a lot more readable JSON text. So you can see that we have gotten recipes, and in particular one recipe. So you see this is just one object. We get one recipe, and here we get all of the properties of the recipe, and some of the properties are of type array, for example, extended ingredients. And here we have all of the ingredients. So ingredients 1, ingredients 2, ingredients 3. So for example, cheese is an ingredient for that. Then, well, it says goat cheese here. There's even an image that it gives us. Then the salt, well, we need salt, we need cranberry sauce, and yeah, that's it. So these are the ingredients. Then we have some additional details like dish type, diets, instructions, and so forth. Okay, so that was an example of how we can use the HTTP module and use an API, and specifically make an API request to a API that we got access to. So this is a free API, at least for some things. So for the random page, for example, but then if you wanted to build a fully designed and more complex, let's say cooking application that you're offering to users out there through an application or a website or whatever, then you would have to take one of the paid tiers usually, because in the free tier, you just get 150 points per day, which is good enough for what we want to do, but we can only make one request per second. Otherwise, we would have to wait. So let's say you have 100 users and 2 of them are trying to make a request at the same time. One of them would have to wait for a second for the response to happen if they are using the free tier, or if you are using the free tier. Okay, so that's the thing with APIs. There are APIs out there that are entirely free. Then there are APIs that have a free tier, but then there are also APIs that are always expensive or that are always paid, so that you always need to pay money for. Good. So that was step number 3. And we're going to make sure that we understand how we can make a request automation in the next video. Okay. And by the way, if you want to go super in depth, definitely make sure that you join my AI Automation Specialist community. You will find the link in the description below. There you get access to my AI Automation Masterclass course, as well as a bunch of templates that will not only teach you how to build amazing automations, but that you can also use in order to automate a bunch of stuff in your own business, or automate stuff for other businesses and make money along the way. So you could start your own business as a consultant, as a developer, or as an AI automator. So that's something that you're going to get from my school community. I'd be happy to see you there. So you can find the link in the description below. And thanks a lot for watching. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and see you in the next video.